Welcome to one of the most unsettling and mysterious cases ever recorded in the history of Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to share in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're always curious to see how far these forgotten accounts travel and at what strange hours of day or night they find their audience. In the early autumn of 1856, when the Mayfield estate still stood in all its glory at the edge of Westmoreland County, Virginia, a series of events began that would forever stain the reputation of one of the oldest merchant families in the Commonwealth. The documentation of these events remained sealed in county archives until 1963, when a graduate student uncovered them while researching the economic impact of shipping routes along the Puyallup River. What started as an academic pursuit quickly descended into something much darker. The Mayfield estate had been built on the profits of tobacco and shipping, situated strategically near the river with a view that stretched for miles. Edward Rowland had taken over the family business after his father-in-law's passing, marrying into the wealth rather than inheriting it directly. His wife Margaret had died during childbirth, leaving him alone with their daughter, Clara. By all accounts found in the parish records and local newspaper clippings, Edward was respected, if not particularly well liked. His business acumen was undeniable, but there was something in his manner that kept others at a distance. The Westmoreland County Gazette described him as a man of firm constitution and firmer opinions, whose handshake felt like a contract rather than a greeting. Clara Mayfield, 22 years of age, according to baptismal records, was her father's opposite in nearly every way. Where he was calculating, she was impulsive. Where he measured value in ledgers and property, she found it in poetry and music. Several accounts from household staff gathered decades later by local historian Samuel Thornton described her as possessing a peculiar kind of quiet strength that seemed at odds with her delicate appearance. She had received an education unusual for women of that time. Her father had hired tutors from as far as Richmond and even Philadelphia, perhaps attempting to compensate for the absence of maternal influence. The Mayfield household employed 12 servants, a fact confirmed by tax records from 1855 and 1856. Among them was a man named Isaiah. No last name appears in any official documentation, as was common for enslaved people at that time. According to inventory records from the estate, Isaiah had been purchased 4 years prior from a plantation in North Carolina. The bill of sale found in 1868 during the settlement of Rowland's estate described him simply as male, approx 25 years, literate, skilled with horses, sound of body and mind. What happened between Isaiah and Clara would later become the subject of whispered conversations and stern warnings throughout Virginia's Tidewater region for years to come. But the truth, as documented in fragments across personal journals, legal records, and newspaper clippings, was far more complex and far more disturbing than the simplified cautionary tale it would become. The first indication that something unusual was developing came in the spring of 1856. Edward Rowland's personal ledger, recovered from a locked drawer in his study during the estate inventory, contained an entry dated April 17th. Observed C conversing with I in the stables for the third time this week. Duration of conversation approx 20 minutes. Topics unknown. Must speak with her about appropriate boundaries with the help. 2 weeks later, another entry read simply conversation with C regarding proper household management. She remains stubborn on the matter. Will consider reassigning I to fieldwork if situation continues. What Edward Rowland observed as improper fraternization was, according to later accounts, something far deeper. A partial letter never sent was discovered in 1862 by a Union soldier who had requisitioned the abandoned Mayfield house as temporary quarters during the Peninsula Campaign. The letter, written in what handwriting experts later confirmed as Clara's read in part, cannot express in words what these moments mean. The risk we take each time we speak only makes the words more precious. Your understanding of Bedietzworth exceeds that of anyone I've encountered, even among those born to privilege and education. How cruel that the world should place such artificial barriers between minds so clearly meant to. The letter ended there, torn at the bottom as if hastily destroyed. The Union soldier, a Lieutenant James Morrison from Massachusetts, kept the fragment as a curiosity and mentioned it in his personal war journal, which was later donated to the Harvard University archives in 1923. By summer of 1856, Edward Rowland's concern had evidently grown. His business associate, Thomas Blackwood, mentioned in correspondence dated July 8th. Edward seems distracted of late. When pressed, he mentioned some concerns about his daughter's behavior, though he refused to elaborate. He has always been protective of Clara, perhaps to a fault. But there is something different in his manner now, a nervousness I have not witnessed before. According to household accounts collected by historian Thornton in the 1940s, Edward began to restrict Clara's movements around this time. She was no longer permitted to ride alone, and her visits to neighboring properties became less frequent. A former house servant named Martha, interviewed in 1942 at the age of 97, recalled, "Miss Clara's face changed that summer. She used to smile all the time, even when no one was looking. Then she stopped. She'd sit at her window for hours watching the stables." Master Roland had moved Isaiah to the tobacco fields by then. You could see it wearing on her like a dress that's washed too many times. What occurred during this period of separation can only be pieced together from fragmented accounts. The parish records show that Clara attended Sunday services regularly, though several entries in the minister's personal diary note her distracted demeanor and pallor, suggesting poor health or troubled sleep. Edward Roland increased his business travel during this time, making 3 trips to Richmond and 1 extended journey to Philadelphia, according to shipping manifests and hotel registries preserved in business records. Isaiah, meanwhile, was documented as having attempted to escape in late August, according to a notice placed in the Westmoreland County Gazette on September 3rd. The notice offered a $20 reward for his return and described him as an articulate Negro man of about 30 years, approximately 60 in height, with a scar on his right forearm and knowledge of letters. He was captured 3 days later at a river crossing approximately 15 mi north of the Mayfield property. According to constable records, the punishment for such attempts was typically severe. However, an unusual entry in Edward Roland's ledger dated September 7th reads, "I return standard punishment withheld due to C's inexplicable hysterics. Have confined him to the storage cellar until a buyer can be arranged. Must remove this influence from the household permanently." What happened next represents the turning point in this dark narrative. According to multiple accounts, including those of household staff and neighboring property owners, the night of September 10th was unusually cool for early autumn. A storm had passed through earlier in the day, leaving behind a chill that prompted fires to be lit in the main house for the first time since spring. Edward Roland hosted 3 business associates for dinner that evening, a fact confirmed by kitchen inventory records and a brief mention in the diary of one guest, William Harrison. Harrison's diary, discovered among family papers in 1931, notes, "Dinner at Mayfield was sumptuous as always, though the atmosphere was strained. Miss Clara retired early, claiming a headache, leaving the men to discuss business. Edward seemed relieved at her departure, though he watched her leave with an intensity I found curious. Our host was not himself this evening, drinking more heavily than his usual modest consumption and repeatedly losing the thread of conversation. The men departed around 1100. According to Harrison's account, what occurred after their departure was pieced together decades later from servant testimonies and physical evidence. Sometime after midnight, Clara apparently made her way to the storage cellar where Isaiah was being held. Whether she had obtained a key or found another means of entry remains unknown. What is certain, based on an inventory conducted the following day, is that food was taken from the kitchen. Bread, dried meat, and a small wheel of cheese were noted as missing. 2 horses were also discovered missing from the stables the next morning. Stable hand testimonies recorded as part of the subsequent investigation indicated that the animals had been prepared with care, their hooves wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound of their departure. One stable boy reported hearing movement around 3 in the morning, but assumed it was Edward Roland checking on a prize stallion, as he occasionally did when unable to sleep. By dawn, both Clara Mayfield and Isaiah were gone from the property. Edward Roland's reaction, according to household accounts, was initially one of cold fury. He did not, as might have been expected, immediately alert neighbors or organize a search party. Instead, he locked himself in his study for several hours. When he emerged, according to the housekeeper's later testimony, his face had changed completely, like someone had removed his mask and revealed the real man beneath, and that man was terrified. The official search began that afternoon with notices sent to neighboring counties and a substantial reward offered. But Edward Rowland's actions suggested a man torn between public duty and private greed. He refused to describe the situation as an abduction, instead referring to it as his daughter being led astray or taken through manipulation. He specifically instructed searchers that Clara was not to be harmed under any circumstances, a curious directive given the standard violent response to such situations in that time and place. For 3 weeks, the search continued without success. Then on October 2nd, a letter arrived addressed to Edward Rowland. The envelope bore no return address, but was postmarked from Philadelphia. The contents of this letter were not made public during Rowland's lifetime, but it was discovered among his personal effects after his death. Written in Clara's hand, it read, "Father, by the time you receive this, we will be far beyond your reach. Do not waste resources searching for us. What you laughed at as a foolish girl's affection was in truth the most sincere feeling I have ever known. The cruelty you showed in your dismissal of my heart's choice revealed to me a darkness in your character I can no longer ignore. I have learned things about our family's history that sicken me. Isaiah has shared with me the truth about his origins, a truth I suspect you have always known. The resemblance is unmistakable, as are the implications. That you would treat your own blood with such calculated inhumanity confirms what I have long suspected. Your soul is corrupted beyond redemption. We go to begin a new life where such artificial distinctions hold no power. Do not attempt to follow. I retain enough affection for the father you once were to offer this warning. There are documents in Isaiah's possession that would destroy you and the Mayfield name should they become public. Live your remaining years in the knowledge that your secrets remain safe only through our continued freedom. I leave behind the Mayfield name and all its tainted privilege." Clara, the implications of this letter sent shockwaves through the household. No copy exists in public records. Edward Rowland apparently destroyed the original after reading it, but not before his longtime house servant Abigail glimpsed its contents. Her testimony given in 1872 as part of an unrelated property dispute provided the only contemporary account of the letter's contents. The full text was only recovered in 1949 when Clara's personal journal was discovered in a collection of papers donated to the Philadelphia Historical Society by the family of a prominent Quaker abolitionist. Edward Rowland's reaction to the letter was immediate and severe. According to household accounts, he dismissed 3 servants that same day, all of whom had worked closely with Isaiah. He then ordered the small cabin where Isaiah had lived at the edge of the property to be emptied and burned. Most tellingly, he withdrew the reward and called off the search entirely, claiming publicly that he now believed his daughter had perished during the escape attempt. This explanation was accepted with some skepticism by the community, but without evidence to the contrary, it eventually became the official narrative. For the next several months, Edward Rowland's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Business associates noted his distraction and uncharacteristic errors in judgment. He began to drink heavily, according to household accounts, and was often heard pacing his study late into the night. In December of 1856, he abruptly sold a significant portion of his tobacco fields at well below market value and used the proceeds to purchase a substantial amount of additional land along the river, land that had no obvious agricultural or commercial value. The purpose of this purchase became clear only in the spring of 1857 when Rowland began extensive excavations on the newly acquired property, ostensibly searching for suitable clay deposits for brickmaking. The operation involved an unusual number of workers and continued even after preliminary digging revealed no valuable materials. Local rumors suggested he was searching for something specific, though what that might be was never determined. After 3 months of fruitless digging, the project was abandoned. Edward Rowland retreated further into isolation, rarely leaving the estate except for necessary business. According to church records, he stopped attending services entirely, and his contributions to local charitable causes, previously substantial and regular, ceased. In October of 1857, exactly 1 year after receiving Clara's letter, Edward Rowland was found dead in his study. The official cause of death was recorded as apoplexy, though modern medical historians reviewing the described symptoms suggest alcohol poisoning or possibly suicide as more likely explanations. He was discovered by his housekeeper, seated at his desk with a leather-bound journal open before him. The final entry, dated the night of his death, reads simply, "I hear her laughter in the hallways. She knows." They both know. The Mayfield estate passed to a distant cousin as Edward Rowland had no other children and had never remarried. The new owner, having no attachment to the property, sold it within 6 months to a tobacco merchant from Richmond. The house changed hands several more times over the following decades, developing a reputation for misfortune. A fire damaged the east wing in 1864, and the property was briefly occupied by Union forces during the Civil War. By 1870, it stood empty, the once grand rooms gradually surrendering to decay and neglect. As for Clara and Isaiah, their fate remained unknown for many years. No official record of their capture exists, suggesting they successfully escaped the reach of Virginia law. The Philadelphia connection mentioned in Clara's letter offered a tantalizing clue, but extensive searches of census records and church registries from that period revealed no conclusive evidence of their presence. Then in 1959, a remarkable discovery was made in the archives of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. Among a collection of personal accounts from escaped slaves and their supporters was a brief entry dated May 1857. It described a recently arrived couple of unusual circumstances. The woman, formerly of high social standing in Virginia, her companion, a man of exceptional education despite his former enslaved status. The entry noted that they had been provided with funds and letters of introduction to contacts in Montreal, where sympathy for their situation might be greater and legal protections more secure. Canadian records from this period are incomplete, but a church registry from a small parish outside Montreal lists a marriage in July 1857 between a Clara M. and Isaiah F. The newly adopted surname redacted in the document, but beginning with F. The registry describes them as recent arrivals from the United States seeking refuge and God's blessing upon their union. This is the last documented trace of Clara Mayfield and Isaiah found in official records. Whether they remained in Canada, continued further north, or perhaps even sailed to Europe, where racial attitudes were somewhat less rigid, remains unknown. What is certain is that they vanished completely from American records, successfully escaping both the legal consequences and social ostracism their union would have guaranteed. But the most disturbing aspect of this narrative emerged only in 1968 when the Mayfield estate, by then abandoned and scheduled for demolition to make way for a housing development, was being cleared of remaining artifacts. Workers removing wooden panels in what had been Edward Rowland's study discovered a hidden compartment containing a small tin box. Inside was a collection of documents that cast the entire story in a new and horrifying light. Among these documents was a bill of sale dated 1831 for a female slave of approximately 20 years named Leah, purchased from the estate of Thomas Jenkins of North Carolina. Accompanying this was a personal letter from Jenkins to Edward Rowland referencing a special arrangement and discretion appreciated in this delicate matter. Most damning of all was a baptismal record indicating that Lee had given birth to a son in 1832. The father's name was not recorded, but a note in the margin written in what handwriting experts later confirmed as Edward Rowland's script read, "My indiscretion to be raised separately and never informed of his origins." The implications were clear and revolting. Isaiah had been Edward Rowland's unacknowledged son, born to an enslaved woman and later purchased by his own father as a servant. Whether Edward had always known this when acquiring Isaiah, or perhaps recognized the resemblance later, cannot be determined with certainty. Clara's letter suggests Isaiah had somehow discovered this connection and shared it with her, a revelation that transformed their relationship from forbidden romance to something far more complex. This discovery explained the cryptic references in Clara's letter and the extreme nature of Edward Rowland's reaction. It was not merely social disapproval or racial prejudice that drove his efforts to separate them. It was the need to conceal a truth that would have destroyed his reputation and possibly led to legal consequences even in the antebellum South. The documents were examined by historians and authenticated, but by that time, 1968, the story was considered primarily of academic interest. The Mayfield name had long since faded from prominence, and there were no direct descendants to be affected by the revelation. The papers were cataloged and stored in the Virginia Historical Society archives, where they remained largely forgotten until the graduate student's discovery in 1963 brought the entire narrative back to light. The Mayfield estate was demolished as planned, and a suburban development now stands on the land where these events unfolded. Residents occasionally report unusual sounds, footsteps on stairs when no one is there, laughter echoing from empty rooms, hushed conversations that cease when one enters a space. Most dismiss these as the settling of houses or tricks of the wind. Few know the history of the ground beneath their homes or the dark secrets it once contained. Perhaps somewhere descendants of Clara and Isaiah live on, carrying a complex legacy they may never fully understand. Or perhaps their line ended with them, the truth of their story preserved only in scattered documents, and the whispers that still seem to echo through the Virginia countryside on particularly still nights. Some secrets, it seems, refuse to remain buried even after more than a century of silence. And as for Edward Rowland, local legend holds that on certain autumn nights, particularly around the anniversary of his death, the sound of digging can be heard on the undeveloped land where he once conducted his frantic excavations. What he was searching for, forgiveness, understanding, or perhaps some document he feared might exist, remains unknown. But the earth, it seems, keeps its secrets more faithfully than human hearts ever could. In 1965, the last physical remnant of the Mayfield estate, a small family cemetery at the edge of what was once their property, was relocated to make way for a highway expansion. Among the weathered stones was Edward Rowland's grave, the inscription nearly illegible after years of neglect. As workers excavated the site, they discovered something unusual. The coffin had been disturbed long before their arrival. The lid had been partially removed and then replaced as if someone had opened it years after the burial. Inside, alongside Rowland's remains, was a folded piece of paper too deteriorated to be read. Whether this represented some final communication from Clara, a symbolic act of closure, or something else entirely will never be known. Some stories have no true ending. They simply fade into the background noise of history, occasionally resurfacing when chance or curiosity brings them momentarily back to light. The strange case of the Mayfield family is one such tale, a dark reminder of how the sins of one generation can echo through those that follow, and how even the most carefully guarded secrets eventually find their way into the light. The graduate student who uncovered these records in 1963 published a brief academic paper on the social implications of the case, but found little interest among his peers. He abandoned the research shortly afterward, citing disturbing dreams and an unsettling feeling of being watched while working with the materials. His academic career faltered, and he left Virginia abruptly in 1964, moving west and reportedly refusing to discuss the Mayfield case again. Perhaps some stories are best left untold. Perhaps some secrets serve as warnings across time. But in the quiet corners of Virginia's historical archives, the documents remain, waiting for the next curious mind to piece together this American tragedy. A tale of forbidden love, terrible secrets, and the high price of freedom in a world built on invisible chains. And if you find yourself driving through Westmoreland County as the sun sets and happen to pass the housing development built on the old Mayfield land, local residents advise against stopping. Something in the air there feels heavy with memory, they say. And in the distance, if you listen carefully, you might hear the sound of hoof-beats muffled by cloth carrying two riders away from their past and toward an uncertain future. A sound that has echoed there for more than a century and shows no sign of fading. In 1966, a family that had purchased one of the newer homes on the former Mayfield property reported a series of unusual occurrences. According to county records, they had no prior knowledge of the land's history when they bought the modest two-story colonial. The husband, Robert Sullivan, worked as an engineer at a factory in Richmond, while his wife, Catherine, taught at the local elementary school. They had two teenage children and had moved from Pennsylvania, seeking a quieter life in the Virginia countryside. Within weeks of moving in, Catherine Sullivan began to document strange events in a personal journal discovered years later during an estate sale. Her entries described unexplained temperature drops in specific rooms, particularly the northeast corner of the house, which happened to sit directly above where Edward Rowland's study had once stood. She noted that on multiple occasions she found her daughter's belongings rearranged, particularly books which would be removed from shelves and left open to specific pages, always passages about freedom, escape, or forbidden love. Most disturbing were the dreams. Each family member, independent of the others, reported experiencing vivid nightmares involving a woman in 19th century dress standing at the foot of their beds, sometimes accompanied by a tall male figure whose face remained in shadow. In Catherine's journal, she wrote, "I cannot explain it, but in the dream, I somehow know she is trying to tell me something, to warn me, or perhaps to confess. I wake each time with the same phrase echoing in my mind. Blood recognizes blood." By December 1966, the phenomena had intensified. The family's dog refused to enter certain parts of the house, growing agitated and barking at empty corners. Objects would disappear only to reappear days later in unusual locations. A locket containing a photograph of Catherine's grandmother was found buried 6 in deep in the backyard garden, though no one admitted to placing it there. The breaking point came on the night of February 7th, 1967. According to a police report filed the following morning, the family was awakened around 3:00 a.m. by the sound of someone running up and down the stairs. Robert Sullivan, assuming an intruder had entered the home, armed himself with a baseball bat and investigated. He found no one, but reported that the temperature on the staircase was, in his words, cold enough to see my breath, even though the heat was running. As he returned to the master bedroom, he heard what he described as a woman sobbing coming from his daughter's room. He rushed in to find his 16-year-old daughter sitting upright in bed, eyes open, but seemingly unaware of his presence. According to his statement, she was speaking in a voice entirely unlike her own, deeper, with an accent he described as old Virginia aristocracy. The words she spoke, which Robert Sullivan wrote down immediately afterward, were, "He knows, Father knows what he did. The grave won't hold the truth any longer." The family vacated the house that same night, staying with neighbors until they could arrange temporary accommodation. They never returned to live in the home, selling it at a significant loss 2 months later. In the disclosure statement, Robert Sullivan wrote simply, "House has unresolved issues that make it unsuitable for our family." The new owners, unaware of or undeterred by the previous family's experience, moved in during the summer of 1967. Within 4 months, they too had left, citing personal reasons for their hasty departure. The property changed hands 3 more times over the next decade, never housing any family for longer than 18 months. Local real estate agents eventually began warning potential buyers, though always in carefully worded terms to avoid liability or accusations of perpetuating superstition. In 1978, a paranormal research team from Duke University requested permission to conduct an investigation of the property, which was vacant at the time. County records show that their permit was initially approved, but mysteriously revoked 3 days before the scheduled study. No official explanation was provided, though unofficial accounts suggest pressure from several prominent local families who feared unwanted attention to the area's complex and often troubling history. The most comprehensive attempt to understand the phenomena associated with the former Mayfield estate came in 1983 when historian Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, an expert in 19th century Southern domestic life, purchased the property with the explicit intention of researching its past. Dr. Whitfield's academic credentials and methodical approach brought a level of legitimacy to the investigation that previous efforts had lacked. For 2 years, Dr. Whitfield lived in the house while conducting extensive research in local archives, interviewing descendants of families who had known the Rowlands, and documenting her own experiences in the home. Her work culminated in a manuscript titled Echoes of Conscience, The Psychological Legacy of Antebellum Atrocity, which was scheduled for publication by the University of Virginia Press in 1986. The manuscript never reached print. 2 weeks before its planned publication date, Dr. Whitfield was found dead in her home from what the coroner ruled a cerebral hemorrhage. She was 53 years old with no prior history of hypertension or vascular issues. More troubling than her unexpected death was the state in which her body was discovered. According to the official report, she was found seated at her desk, pen still in hand, having apparently been in the middle of writing when she died. The page before her contained just 1 line written in what handwriting experts later confirmed was not Dr. Whitfield's usual script. It read, "Some secrets must remain buried." The manuscript itself was never recovered. Dr. Whitfield's research notes, photographs, and audio recordings, which colleagues confirmed had existed and had been meticulously organized, were missing from the house. The only item found was a small leather-bound journal identified as belonging to Edward Rowland, which had not been previously documented in any historical archive. The journal contained mostly mundane business entries, but the final pages had been torn out. This journal was cataloged by the Virginia Historical Society, but subsequently disappeared from their collection in 1991 during a routine inventory. Throughout the 1990s, the house remained vacant, falling into disrepair as legal issues surrounding Dr. Whitfield's estate prevented its sale. Local teenagers occasionally broke in on dares, and their accounts added to the property's ominous reputation. Several reported hearing whispered conversations from empty rooms or seeing a woman in white standing at the upstairs window, even when the house was known to be empty. One particularly detailed account from 1994 described finding a hidden compartment beneath a floorboard containing a small cloth doll and a folded piece of yellowed paper with writing in a language that looked like English but didn't make sense. In 2001, the county finally seized the property for unpaid taxes and scheduled it for demolition, citing structural concerns and its status as an attractive nuisance. The night before the scheduled demolition, a fire of unknown origin destroyed the house entirely. Fire investigators found no evidence of accelerants or electrical faults, ultimately ruling the cause as undetermined. Curiously, though the main structure was reduced to ash, a small section of wall remained standing, the northeast corner, corresponding to what would have been Edward Rowland's study in the original mansion. During the clearing of the site, construction workers made a final discovery that added yet another layer to the Mayfield mystery. Beneath what had been the foundation of the modern house, they unearthed a small metal box similar to the one found in 1968. This one, however, contained just two items: a dagger-type photograph of a young woman presumed to be Clara Mayfield and a letter dated October 10, 1873. Exactly 17 years after the night Clara and Isaiah fled the plantation, the letter, written in a careful hand, read, "To whomever may find this, if you are reading these words, then perhaps the time has come for truth to emerge from shadow. My name was once Clara Mayfield, daughter of Edward Rowland, though I have lived under another name for many years now. I returned to this place one final time to complete what was begun on that autumn night so long ago. Isaiah, my husband, my companion, my brother in blood, if not in name, passed from this world last winter. His final wish was that we should leave no questions unanswered, no secrets hidden for future generations to uncover, piece by tragic piece. The truth is both simpler and more horrific than you might imagine. My father purchased his own son as property. Whether knowing or unknowing at first, I cannot say with certainty. What I know is that by the time Isaiah and I discovered our connection through papers my father had carelessly left accessible. Edward Rowland was fully aware of it. His efforts to separate us were not merely to prevent a socially unacceptable union, but to hide his own shameful past. But there is more, and it is this that compels me to write after so many years of silence. In the confusion of our escape, Isaiah took with him certain documents, including letters between my father and the plantation owner who sold him his own son. These letters revealed a pattern, not an isolated incident. Edward Rowland had fathered at least 3 children with enslaved women across different properties, using his business connections to arrange discreet purchases years later. I write this not to further condemn a man long dead, but because blood has a way of finding its path through generations. Somewhere in Virginia, perhaps even in Westmoreland County, descendants of these unacknowledged branches of the Rowland line may live on, never knowing their true heritage or the bonds that connect them to others. May whoever finds this letter use this knowledge wisely. Some secrets destroy when suddenly revealed, while others poison slowly when kept hidden. I leave it to you to judge which path serves justice best. I have lived a life of unexpected joy in exile, finding in our shared adversity a stronger bond than any conventional union might have offered. Isaiah rests now in Canadian soil, and I will soon join him. But first, this final act of truth-telling, this burying of secrets in the very earth that once witnessed their creation, may peace find this troubled ground at last. Clara. The authenticity of the letter was verified by multiple handwriting experts who compared it to the few surviving samples of Clara Mayfield's writing. Carbon dating confirmed the paper and ink were consistent with the stated date. What remains unclear is how the letter came to be buried beneath a house that would not be built for another century on land that had seen multiple structures come and go in the intervening years. Some local historians have suggested that Clara may have buried the letter and photograph in a specific location marked by some now lost landmark, expecting it to be found much sooner. Others propose more supernatural explanations, though these remain outside the realm of academic consideration. What is certain is that following the letter's discovery and subsequent publication in a regional historical journal, genealogical researchers identified several families in Virginia with genetic and historical connections to the Mayfield-Rowland lineage, including descendants of other enslaved people owned by the family. DNA testing in 2007 confirmed these connections, leading to a remarkable reunion of distant cousins, separated by history's cruelties but united by blood. The land where the Mayfield estate once stood remains vacant to this day. Development plans have been proposed several times, but financial complications, zoning issues, and local opposition have prevented construction. The site has become an unofficial historical landmark, occasionally visited by history students, paranormal enthusiasts, and descendants of those whose lives were entangled in its dark narrative. In 2018, a small memorial plaque was installed at the edge of the property, funded by a coalition of local historical societies and descendants of both the Mayfield and formerly enslaved families. It bears a simple inscription: "In memory of lives divided by human cruelty, but united in courage. May truth bring healing where secrets once brought pain." Visitors to the site often report a feeling of profound sadness that seems to emanate from the ground itself. Yet others describe an unexpected sense of peace, particularly near the location where Clarara's letter was found. Park Ranger James Wilson, who has worked in the area for 23 years, perhaps described it best. "This land has absorbed so much pain, so much deception, but it also witnessed an extraordinary act of courage and love. I think both energies remain, each telling its part of a story we're still learning how to hear." During particularly dry summers, the outlines of the original foundation can sometimes be seen as variations in the growth pattern of the grass, a ghostly footprint of a house long vanished. Local children tell stories about a woman in white who walks the perimeter of this outline on autumn nights, accompanied by a tall man whose face is always turned away from onlookers. Perhaps the most poignant footnote to this story emerged in 2021 when a historian researching Canadian immigration records discovered a small community cemetery outside Montreal with a weathered gravestone bearing the names Isaiah and Clarara Freeman together in life and death. The dates indicated that Clarara had outlived her husband by nearly 20 years, passing away in 1892 at the age of 58. According to church records, she had worked as a teacher in the local school, while Isaiah had become a carpenter known for crafting furniture of exceptional quality. The cemetery registry indicated that they had one daughter born in 1859 and given the name Liberty, a choice that requires no explanation given their history. Liberty Freeman appears in later records as having married and moved to Boston around 1880, where she worked as a writer and advocate for women's suffrage. Her descendants continue the family's tradition of education and advocacy to this day, though until recently few knew the extraordinary origins of their family line. As for Edward Rowland, his legacy is one of wealth squandered by secrets and lives damaged by pride. The mercantile empire he built collapsed within a decade of his death, his reputation tarnished by rumors even before the full truth came to light. His grave in the relocated cemetery receives no visitors, no flowers. Only historians and the occasional curious descendant of those whose lives he altered seek it out, and then only to complete their understanding of a narrative that spans generations. Some say that on the anniversary of Clarara and Isaiah's escape, September 10th, the sound of cloth-muffled hoof beatats can be heard in Westmoreland County moving from the site of the old estate toward the north. Others claim to have seen two riders on the empty road at dawn, visible for just a moment before disappearing into the morning mist. Skeptics dismiss these accounts as imagination fueled by knowledge of the local legend, but those who have experienced them speak with a conviction that gives even hardened doubters pause. Perhaps the final word on this tragic yet ultimately redemptive story should come from Liberty Freeman's journal discovered among her papers after her death in 1927. In an entry dated September 10, 1885, she wrote, "Mother spoke of Virginia today, a rare occurrence. She said something that I believe captures the essence of her extraordinary life. What your grandfather failed to understand was that love is the great destroyer of artificial boundaries. It looks at the walls men build between human hearts, walls of race, class, family, connection, and recognizes them for what they are, imaginary lines drawn by fear. My father laughed at what he could not understand. In doing so, he lost everything, while I, in choosing love despite the cost, gained the only freedom that truly matters. We who inherit this complicated legacy can only strive to honor the courage it represents and ensure that the hard-won wisdom purchased through such suffering is never forgotten. The merchant laughed. But history, it seems, has had the final word. The development that now stands near the site of the original Mayfield estate is called Freeman's Crossing, a name chosen long before the full story came to light in what some might call coincidence, but others might see as another echo of a past refusing to be silenced. Residents report that it is a peaceful place to live, though many keep a small candle burning in their windows on September 10th, a tradition whose origins few can explain, but most feel compelled to maintain. And so the story of Clara Mayfield and Isaiah continues to echo through time, a dark chapter illuminated by moments of extraordinary courage. A tragedy, yes, but one ultimately redeemed by the quiet, unstoppable force of truth finally brought to light. Their memory endures in archives and fading letters, in whispered folklore and scholarly debates, in the very DNA of descendants who may never know the full story of where they come from. Some secrets refuse to remain buried. Some truths will claw their way to the surface, even if it takes centuries for them to find a voice. For those who study such histories, the Mayfield case stands as a haunting reminder that the past never truly ends. It lingers, shaping lives and legacies long after its witnesses have turned to dust. The land itself seems to bear witness, holding within its soil both the weight of cruelty and the quiet grace of redemption. It stands as a living memorial to what can be destroyed through deceit and to what can be reclaimed through the simple, revolutionary act of recognizing our shared humanity. The ground remembers, even when we choose to forget. And if we listen closely, beyond the noise of time, beyond the silence of neglect, we may still hear what it's trying to tell us, lessons of courage, of truth, and of the invisible threads that bind us together whether we acknowledge them or not. In the end, that may be Clara and Isaiah's most enduring legacy. Not the scandal of their disappearance, but the truth they refused to let die. A truth that still rises fragment by fragment into the light.